very simply, 2 years ago, we began approaching the AIDS Institute about two very important issues. One is changing the standards of care for initiation of treatment around HIV here in New York State. And the second issue that is tied to it is the definition of HIV disease. So the state has still yet to promulgate new standards of care for HIV, though the appropriate bodies have developed new standards of care. Fortunately, for once, New York State has been superseded by a more progressive federal government. So on December 1st, the Department of Health and Human Services issued new standards of care for initiation of ARVs. They changed the standards of care to recommend, in the AIDS definition, all of those services are tied to achieving this definition. So, what we have done by the failure to change the definition is given people a Hobson's choice. If I'm homeless or low income, do I start treatment when the standards of care recommend that I start treatment? Or do I wait until I get sick enough to qualify for housing and other supportive services? If I start treatment at 500, which is what is absolutely recommended by the new federal standards of care, I will undoubtedly stabilize disease progression, which means that I will never become eligible for housing, nutritional support, transportation, and any of those other services. Now, if you take a look at the chain study reports and any of the research that looks at homelessness and HIV, there's a tremendous correlation between housing and ability to adhere to medication, and between housing and engagement in risk behaviors. So we need in New York State to change the definition, and we can very simply change the definition to HIV positive. It makes sense to tie the definition of HIV disease to the initiation of treatment. And now the national standard for initiating, for offering the initiation of treatment is as soon as someone is diagnosed. So that is logically the definition. That as soon as somebody is diagnosed, as soon as they're contemplating starting treatment, that is when they need housing assistance, that is when they need nutritional support, that is when they need transportation, that is when they need all of the services that would keep them adhering to their medication and make it far less likely that they find themselves engaging in high-risk behaviors that transmit the virus. So what we're asking very simply of the Advisory Council to do is that you discuss this matter today, that you pass a resolution calling on the medical director of the New York State AIDS Institute to issue a new definition for HIV disease that would make seropositivity itself the defining feature. That's really all it is. It's not complicated. It's not hard to digest. If people want to know what kind of financial ramifications, we've provided all of the financial ramifications. We've done all kinds of modeling for the New York State Health Department to look at. We've met with Commissioner Daines on all of these issues. But frankly, I don't think it's the business of the AIDS Advisory Group to be worrying about what the financial ramifications are for New York State. I think it's the business of the HIV/AIDS Advisory Group to be making the best recommendations possible on behalf of New Yorkers who are living with AIDS and HIV. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. King. Do members...
Initiation of ARVs for anyone who has T-cell count below 500, and to offer ARVs to anyone who is HIV positive. We think that this is, while there are complications, we think that this is a very favorable step and very much in accord with what the International AIDS Society U.S. panel recommended. But that has a very important implication accommodations for low-income people, particularly homeless people who are living with HIV in New York State. In the late 80s, the AIDS Institute, in its wisdom, for purposes of rate reimbursement, implemented the terminology HIV disease. HIV disease has no particular medical utilization. It was merely established for setting rate reimbursement for the AIDS designated centers. However, in its wisdom, the New York State Legislature, when it passed the enhanced rental assistance for people with HIV/AIDS legislation, used this definition to define who in New York State is eligible for enhanced rental assistance. Not only that, but then in 1997, when Tom Dwayne successfully got passed in the New York City Council, the bill that established, codified the existence of the HIV/AIDS Services Administration, it also used this definition. Both Local Law 49 of 1997 and state legislation that established rental assistance empower the medical director of the New York State AIDS Institute to define HIV disease from time to time. However, the New York State AIDS Institute has essentially refused to revisit the definition, saying it doesn't use the definition anymore because it doesn't use the same rate methodology setting system. Nonetheless, the legislation by both the New York State Legislature and New York City Council give the state director, medical director of the AIDS Institute, the absolute authority to unilaterally change that definition. Now here's why this is so very important. Right now, the definition of HIV disease, you can go on the AIDS Institute website and see it, defines HIV disease as a T-cell count below 200 or an AIDS-defining opportunistic infection. So think about the implications of that definition when we now have federal standards of care urging implementation of ARVs